What is up, everybody? It is finally time for me to give my first impressions review on the PlayStation VR2. So I got this on launch day. I pre-ordered it way back when, and I've been trying my best to play as many different VR games and get many different experiences using this headset over the past couple of weeks. I've done a number of live streams as well, and after now completing 2 different VR games and playing over 11 in total, I think I've had enough experience with this thing to be able to tell you my definitive thoughts on what I like about it, what I don't like about it, what some of my concerns are, and whether or not I recommend that you go out and buy it right now. So to set the stage a little bit, I did own the original PlayStation VR. I have also owned the Meta Quest 2, and I enjoyed both of those headsets. The original PlayStation VR was my introduction to VR gaming, and I was extremely impressed with that one, being that I could pretty much immediately jump into Resident Evil, Biohazard, and it was a gigantic disappointment for me when I could not play Resident Evil Village on launch, but we'll get back to that whenever I rank all 11 games that I played. Keep your eye out for that video. So the PlayStation VR2 has been both a highly anticipated and a highly criticized piece of hardware that has been advertised over the past year. There's a lot of criticism coming from the way that PlayStation kind of treated the PlayStation VR original with the library of games and not really supporting it all that much. There was also a lot of controversy regarding the price, and also a lot of people saying that PlayStation probably should have invested their time and money and resources into making a mobile device rather than diving back into VR, which didn't fare that well for them the first time. And regardless of my thoughts of this hardware, I would tend to agree with that. So starting off with all of the things that I like about this PlayStation VR hardware. Now, when you buy this, you obviously get this headset. You get the 2 PlayStation VR Sense controllers right here, and there's also bundles available where you can get Horizon Call of the Mountain, and that is the one that I got. And that was $650 for all of that. And so when you're paying that much money, you obviously want a bang for your buck. And one of the biggest concerns that I had is what exactly about this hardware is going to be so different and so much better than the previous hardware to merit buying an entirely new headset. And that is one thing that I will say I was pleasantly surprised with through using this, is that this headset is better in pretty much every single way than the PlayStation VR, including the controllers that you use with it. First of all, you have this serious minimization as far as cords. For those that remember the original PlayStation VR, you had so many different cables. You had HDMI cables. There was a processing box that had like 4 different hookups to it that then had to be routed to your HDMI. It was a gigantic clusterfuck. And while once you initially get it set up, if you have, kind of a setup where you can hide it behind your entertainment center, it wasn't the biggest glaring issue. It was absolutely obnoxious, the amount of cords and hardware you had to hook into the original PlayStation VR to be able to tether it to your PS4 just to be able to play a game. This time around, it's just one cord, and it's a long-ass cord too. You just plug it right into the front of your PlayStation 5. So all of that mess is now just consolidated to one cord, and that is a gigantic improvement as far as I'm concerned. Not only for cleanup and storage, but just if I decide I want to take this downstairs and play it on a different PSVR or a different PlayStation 5 system, I'm not getting like a fucking moving box and taking everything downstairs. I'm just grabbing this and rolling up one cord and moving. You're also not required to have the PlayStation camera anymore. Now, there is a camera for the PlayStation 5, but it's only used for live streaming. And, it's a peripheral that's just for a system. It's not the most impressive camera in the world, but you don't have to have that to have this work. The camera's right here on the front. It's all built into here. It can recognize all of your surroundings. It can recognize the lighting. It can track these VR Sense controllers. And so gone are the days where you have to have a room lit up, plus have a camera in front of you, plus always stay in front of that camera and don't go off to the side, and you can't veer too much if you're actually standing and playing. All of that is gone. As long as this thing is plugged into the PlayStation 5, it's going to be able to track you, provided you have a lit room. Now, as far as the display inside of here, it is more than double the resolution of the PlayStation VR, and it also has HDR support. Now, I do think that it looks impressive when it does look clear. There are some games that utilize that better than others. You have games like Resident Evil Village and kind of the flagship game at launch, the Horizon Call of the Mountain, that utilizes that HDR and tries to impress you with the visuals. Other games not so much. And so that's really going to depend on the library of games that we get as this thing develops, on how much that resolution is really going to be pushed and put to the test. But as of right now, it is an improvement. I also think that this headset is extremely comfortable, and I love the fact that there is so many different points of adjustability here, which is important because all of us are built different. Our heads are different sizes, our heads are different lengths and widths, and we all have different tolerances for tightness and looseness. And so even just the screen here at the front, you have a button where you press it and it can extend back and forth. So if you don't want it to be pressed against your face, or if you're somebody that has glasses, you can adjust how far away the screen is to your eyes. There is also the way that you actually put it onto your head. So this little dial here, you spin it to tighten it, you press the button to loosen it. So all you do is press this in, you pull out that strap, you get it attached to your head. This goes on the back, pretty much on the lower end of the back of your skull. This actually sits more forward and on top. And then you dial it in for how tight you actually want it. And once you're comfortable, you can move it around, you could shake your head, you could jump up and down. And this thing is not going to go anywhere as long as you have it snug on there. And then you just press the button and do the reverse. There's also a little wheel right here this time. So the actual eyepieces here, you do the wheel and it changes the distance between those, because again, all of our eyes are different spaced apart. And so if they're not aligned correctly, the image is just going to be blurry, and it's going to cause motion sickness if you don't have it as clear as you need it to be. So you have an initial setup to where you adjust the dial, it actually fixes onto your eyes, and it lets you know when everything is centered. And so that's another piece that I think is much better. The last PSVR, it just had a couple of click locations and not really a whole lot of adjustability in between. Much more range of motion now on this one. You also have the ability for these built-in headphones. So there's this little strap right here, this little cable that actually plugs into the back of the headset. And on the sides of the headset, you have these little storage locations for these different earbuds. Now, these earbuds that are bundled inside of the PSVR, obviously they're fine. It's not going to be like Bose headsets or anything like that. You can take this out and plug in whatever headset or earbuds you want, so that's a good feature as well. But the ones that are built in here that are tethered across, that aren't going to be like some huge dangling cords, I think they actually work pretty damn well. When I was playing Resident Evil Village, especially with the volume all the way up, talk about immersion. Another feature that I like quite a bit is this little function button down here. So if you are playing a VR game and you need to actually see the real life room, you can press that button and these cameras will pause the game and then show you a black and white display image of everything around you. So let's say someone's trying to get your attention, or you're hitting something and want to know what it is, or you set your controllers down to take a drink, or your phone rings, whatever it is. If you don't want to physically take the headset off, but you need to see outside, you just press that button and immediately you get the view of everything around you. And that is a huge help, especially for controllers like these, where if you set them down, you have to grab them in a very specific way. And sometimes, especially when you're getting used to them, it's hard to just have muscle memory. It's easier to see where you're sticking your hands. Another feature that I like quite a bit is that because it is tethered to the console, it also streams very well to your TV display. Now, you can turn this on after you have your PlayStation 5 turned on and only use this, so your TV and your soundbar and all that stays off and you're displaying through this. You could probably even have somebody watching TV or watching a movie while you're playing things in the same setup. I didn't test that, but in theory, I believe that would work. But let's say you have friends over and they want to be able to see what you're playing. This streams exactly what you are seeing to your TV display. There's no delay. There's no like little boxed image where they're only seeing a little flat image and there's a bunch of black space. It's quite literally whatever you are seeing displayed onto your television. And that also worked very well whenever I was streaming. I streamed my entire experience playing Resident Evil Village through OBS, and all of my viewers got to see exactly what I saw here. It wasn't some weird functionality version of that isn't very aesthetically pleasing. Now, the two biggest things that are in addition to here that are pretty much going to be the features that everybody is talking about, one of them is eye tracking. So when you're initially setting up this headset, there is a part where you have a blacked out screen and a little red dot pops up and you have to follow it with your eyes. And so the headset kind of gets used to where your eyes' positions are. And once you do that, and everything is customized and everything is set up. You actually go through this little tech demo thing where you can look all the way around, and it's like almost like musical notes. Like you can look at all the way and see exactly how fast and how accurate the eye tracking is. And the only game that I've seen so far that really uses that function is Horizon Call of the Mountain, to where the functionality of it is that whatever you are focusing on, that is where the headset is going to focus all of its energy to try to make that specific section of the image the best resolution, but also you can navigate menus through it. So if you choose that option on Call of the Mountain, Call of the Menu, when you have menu options, all you got to do is look at it and the cursor goes right to it. And it's weird when you first do it, but it's actually a really crazy piece of innovation there. So I'm really interested in seeing what games in the future are going to use eye tracking, especially horror games. I can imagine wherever you're looking, they know where to put the shit that's going to jump out and scare you. At least that's where my mind goes. But yeah. That tells you about my personality, I guess. And then, of course, these VR Sense controllers, which I think are a massive improvement over the PlayStation Move controllers that we used to have that were kind of trying to be like the Wii remotes. Was never a fan of those. You know, the couple of games that I actually did try to play, namely shooting games with those, even with the little, you know, machine gun peripherals where you can click it in, I just never found them to be all that interesting or all that reactive or that comfortable to play. These, while taking a minute to get used to the whole sticking your hand through a certain way and figuring out how you're supposed to grab it, once you get used to that, they are awesome. They essentially split the PlayStation controller in half to where on one side you have X and O, and on the other side you have triangle and square. Cross and O, excuse me. Somebody's going to fucking correct me on that. But you also, on both of them, have these adaptive triggers, very similar to the DualSense controller. And you also have this other button here that is for this, which is basically your R1 and your L1 button. And so there's times where, like in Village, where this is how you grab your weapon and this is how you shoot it. And with the adaptive triggers, there is tension, there is feedback, there is rumble here. And you also, this circular part right here allows the camera to track you very accurately. Very rarely did I have any issues with the camera tracking my hand accurately. And it was really only when the lighting didn't allow 100%, where sometimes my thing would glitch out. Now, all I would have to do is just stick it in front of my face and it would reset and everything would be fine. And that's like a momentary issue. But as far as playing certain games, like playing Resident Evil Village, playing Call of the Mountain, even some of the other VR games that I've tried, this is an extremely comfortable VR controller setup to where, of the ones that I've played thus far, the original PlayStation VR with the Move controllers, the Quest 2 with a similar version to this, these are the best VR controllers I have used thus far. This, just like with the PlayStation 5, the controllers are kind of the star of the show. And I've also been impressed with how long the charge remains on these things. Now, I did buy the little charging setup where you put these little USB pieces in and then you have a docking station. So every time I get done playing, I stick these onto there. But I have not had a single gameplay session yet where I've had to stop because the controller has ran out of battery. And I've played Resident Evil Village in like 3-hour plus segments. So been really impressed with the battery life on these. And now let's get into some of the negatives / concerns that I have for this headset. And the number one concern, which is going to be everybody's number one concern, is the price. This bitch is expensive. Is it as expensive as maybe some other super professional high-grade VR headsets? No, but it is still expensive. It's more expensive than the PlayStation 5 hardware itself. And there's also the negative drawback that you actually have to have a PlayStation 5 to be able to use this. If this was just a standalone piece of hardware where you can just, like the Quest 2, you have some functionality in here where you can have the game stored in memory and you can play it with this and don't need to be tethered to a console, then I think that price would be a little more justifiable because essentially you're buying a completely different system. But the fact that to be able to play anything on the PlayStation VR, you have to spend over $1,000 between the PlayStation 5 system and the VR2 hardware, that is really expensive for most households. And I don't see many people outside of VR enthusiasts or people that just want to play everything buying that. You get a lot for your money, They definitely give you a bang for your buck, but they require a lot of bucks for that bang. Also, while I love the fact that there's only one cable tethering you to the PS5 this time around, it still becomes an occasional annoyance to be tethered to a cable. Now, it's something I got used to, and there's certain games where, you know, the cable essentially is guided forward, so it just kind of sits right here along your shoulder while you're playing. And so for the most part, it stays out of your way, and 95% of the time I have been playing seated and not standing. But there have been some games, Resident Evil Village, the one that I keep bringing up, namely, to where there are so many little positions that you have to do and have to grab for to grab certain weapons and items that I would always be knocking into that cord or grabbing it, to where I actually started playing it with it behind me, tucked behind. But then if you're seated, sometimes it gets stuck on your shoulder and you're yanking yourself whenever you move your head. When I was playing standing, the first couple of days that I had this, playing things like Call of the Mountain and Pistol Whip, it's a little dangerous, because even though if you have a big wide open space with no real obstacles and you can kind of move around and walk backwards, and you can set a play area for safety just like you can with the Quest, there are times where I think people are going to step on this cord or trip on this cord or get the cord hung up on something that makes some of these games where you have to be really active with your movement a little bit concerning. Like Pistol Whip predominantly is a game where you have to be physically moving. It doesn't even really function that well as a seated game, because you have these obstacles sometimes where there's these pillars and you have to move to the left and to the right, and sometimes you can just move your head. Sometimes you physically have to move like 2 feet to the left or 2 feet to the right to dodge these obstacles per the gameplay. And I was nervous as shit playing this in my living room, which is pretty wide open, because I kept feeling like I'm going to get into the game and I'm going to step on this cord and either rip it out of my headset or trip and fall and bust this thing in half or bust myself up. And so that is a concern. It's most games, you're probably going to be fine. Some games, that cord's an issue. Something that was very annoying for me, which is kind of par for the course for PlayStation. Look, I'm a PlayStation fanatic, but Xbox has always been more user-friendly when it comes to this. Backwards compatibility. All of the original PlayStation VR games are not backwards compatible with the PlayStation VR2. Some of them you can play, but that's the ones where the developers have actually brought out a new updated version for it. And it's because you have things like the move controller, the sense controllers and the adaptive triggers and the rumble function inside of the headset, which I didn't even mention that as a positive. There's actually a rumble feature inside of the headset, so if you get shot in the head or if you bonk your head on something, it actually rumbles. Even more immersion. Stick that on the positives. Totally forgot about that. But there are new functionalities to this hardware that does not comply with the older games. And so your entire PlayStation VR library, you cannot just put on a PlayStation VR2 and go back and play those games. And to me, that is extremely fucking annoying when they've had, a couple of years minimum to start doing some of that. And it's up to the developers. It's not necessarily PlayStation, but that is frustrating when you have a library of games that you have already purchased and you can't play them on the PlayStation VR2. You would have to go and get the adapter and hook up and keep your PlayStation VR original attached to your console to be able to play that. Fuck that. Now, two things that are going to vary completely on the game that you are playing, as well as the type of chair that you are using. Two things that I did have an occasional annoyance with. One of them is the automated play area. So when you initially turn on the headset, you get this thing where it basically checks the lighting of the room, it checks your position. Once in a while, it might need you to kind of reset where you're at, and you'll have to look around and do this little AI thing where it tracks all the objects around you. But typically, you turn the console on, you turn the headset on, it adjusts to the lighting, and then it sets your play area, which is basically this big circle grid that is your safe area to play. And if you, either your headset or your hands with the sense controllers go outside of that boundary, you get a big red circle inside of the game that's like, oh, you're going outside of your boundary. And so many times, namely when I was playing Townsman VR, it would stick that circle on me, and I don't know if maybe I just have longer arms than the average person, but I would barely be extended out, and it's like, you're beyond your boundaries. And so I would physically, when it was doing that, would have to lean forward so that it would set the boundary closer to me and give much more of a range around me and to the front of me to be able to play without constantly seeing circles. And so I don't know if that was just a Townsman VR issue. I don't know if that's just something with the chair that I was seated on, but there was plenty of times where I physically had to manipulate the play area to not have that annoying circle the entire fucking time that I was playing. Now, when you're standing, you don't have that issue. I mean, there will be a play area, but you also have the thing where you can kind of draw on the floor and create more of a customized play area versus just having a circle that extends 2 feet or so beyond the stationary position that you're in. The other issue is that some games I think function extremely well in a seated position. There was a couple of them that actually say that the best experience to play this game is in a seated position. But there were a couple of them that, regardless of the fact that they say that you can play them seated, doesn't quite work that way. The main culprit of that being Pistol Whip, where there are times where there are certain levels where you can go through and have the experience and play the game and have a blast, and if you have things that you have to dodge, you can just physically bounce your head to the left and to the right and dodge these things. But there are some levels where you physically have to move a foot or two to the left or to the right, as I mentioned earlier, and you can't do that in a seated position, and that annoyed the shit out of me, because if you say I can play it seated, why the hell aren't these obstacles just being like taken out of this level? Why is there not a function for that? Why is there not like a thing inside of the game that knows you're playing seated and says, okay, he can't move 1 or 2 feet to the left and to the right, so all obstacles need to be a certain space apart to where you can stay seated. So there'll be like a big pillar coming, and I'm like, okay, I guess I'm losing health. Bash! And then there's just no way to get around it. And there's also a bit of an issue with some games to where shooting games, namely, for what I've played so far, where you have to reach down and grab something. And when you're seated, especially in a chair that has armrests, it is difficult to get your hands where they need to be. And in Resident Evil Village, namely, there's 3 or 4 different spots. There's a spot where you can open up your jacket, there's a spot where you can grab the map, and a little lower is where you can grab a weapon. And even on this side, there's different functionality for it. And when you're shooting, you have to go down and you have to grab the clip and reload. And when you're seated, sometimes it is very difficult to try to get your hands in the right position. I got used to it, but it is certainly meant to be something where you're standing, and that is much more of a fluid experience. So I wish that there was maybe a little bit of customizability there where you can adjust how high those things are as far as the bottom of your play area or something along those lines. But the major concern for the PlayStation VR2, which is the same thing that most people were concerned about when they announced this and announced the price, and the thing that guided whether or not they wanted to pre-order or buy this thing at launch or just wait. And that is whether or not PlayStation is actually going to support this thing with a healthy game library. When I bought the PlayStation VR original, the only solid game that was out for that thing for quite a while was Resident Evil Biohazard, and that was the only full-on game that you could play in VR. Everything else was essentially a tech demo or a little thing to showcase some things that the PSVR does. And they had a few games come out after that. They had like Iron Man VR, which I did not get a chance to play. They had a couple of games like, what was it, Blood and Truth. There was one that was like a military shooter that was a full-on game. But for the lifetime of that headset, it was not anywhere near the amount of games that you would think you would get for something that expensive. And that is my biggest concern with this hardware, is like, okay, as of right now, you have a couple of games that I would consider full-length games, one of which is just a VR mode, Resident Evil Village. But are we just going to get tech demos? Are we just going to get little indie games? Are we just going to get things like Horizon Call of the Mountain that's like, here's what the headset can do, but isn't necessarily what I would call a full-fledged AAA game? Are we going to get things like a Last of Us or Horizon or God of War full-on game? Are they going to create brand new games that are full games for the PSVR2? Because if we're just going to get tech demos and little indie games here and there, despite some of them being very fun, it is absolutely not worth the price. It is absolutely not worth having. And so that is just a big question mark. I'd like to think if they put this much time and effort into the development of this thing and they dived right back into VR gaming to hopefully do it better this time around, that they learned their lessons from the last one. But you're not going to know until they either do it or don't do it. And so while I do think that this thing gives you a hell of a lot of bang for its buck. While I have been very happy and entertained playing with it, and while I think that it is one of the best VR headsets that you can have in like just a home setting right now, unless you're somebody that cannot wait to play Resident Evil Village or cannot wait to play Call of the Mountain, or you absolutely love all of the little smaller indie games and that's what you want the VR experience for, I think it's better to wait, because they might fuck us. So overall, guys, those are my thoughts on the PlayStation VR2 hardware. If you also got this hardware, please let me know your thoughts down below, what you agree with, what you disagree with, or if you've had some other difficulties, or even the difficulties that I mentioned regarding seated gameplay. If you have a workaround for that, or if you have something that is an obvious little function that I missed, please let me know in the comment section below, and let me know what game you want to see get made for the PlayStation VR2. Well, that's it for this one, guys. If you enjoyed that, please click over here for all of my video game reviews so far in 2023. Hasn't been too many of them, but check that out. I'm also going to put my most recent ranking of the God of War games up here if you're a fan of that franchise. Like and share, hit that subscribe button, and as always, remember, the Game Chamber is Commander Shepard's favorite channel on the YouTubes.